Baldur's Gate, Book 1, by Philip Athens. Tom, save me, Abdel called and sliced his sword back to his left, then right. The spider paused and Abdel rolled all the way over to one side, hoping to escape the web. Hair was pulled painfully from his arm, and a strand of web stuck to his neck. He was a fly now, a meal for this 8-legged predator, and like a fly, his desperate struggles only served to cement his captivity in the sticky web. "Hold still," the spider said, and Abdel flinched at the sound of its voice. It was a sound like glass being drawn across steel, and it set Abdel's hair on end as much from the sound of it as from the horror that such a creature had the power of speech at all. "Hold still, human, and let Kriya drain you. Let Kriya drain you dry." Yes. Chapter 1. Welcome to the Baldur's Gate novels, everyone. The blades came together so hard they threw out a blade. Already fucking up. The blades came together so hard they threw out a blue-white spark bright enough to burn its gentle arc into Abdel's vision. The impact sent a shudder through the heavy blade of his broadsword, but he ignored it and pushed back in the direction of the attack. Abdel was strong enough and tall enough to seriously unbalance his opponent. The man stumbled backward 2 steps and brought his empty left hand up to keep from falling. Abdel saw the opening and took full advantage of it, flashing his sword across his opponent's open midsection and slicing deeply through chainmail, flesh, and bone. Abdel recognized 2 of the 4 men who were trying to kill him. The men were sellswords, hired guards, and thugs, just like Abdel. They had obviously been paid, but by whom and for what reason, Abdel couldn't fathom. The man Abdel had killed took 10 or 20 seconds to realize he was dead. Okay. He kept looking down at the gash. 10 seconds. He kept looking down at the deep gash that had nearly cut him in 2. Blood was everywhere, and there was a hint of the yellow-grey of entrails. The expression of the man's face was nearly comical, surprised, pale, somehow disappointed. The look of it made Abdel's heart leap, and he couldn't tell if it was from the horror or the pleasure of the sight. The pause was enough, though, to allow another of the bandits to step in and nearly gut him with one of the 2 small, sharp axes the mercenary spun madly in both hands. "Come on," Abdel said as he skipped back half a step to avoid the second axe. "Long time." He'd worked with this one before, a year ago, guarding a warehouse in Katla that was storing something a very long and increasingly bizarre parade of thieves were intent on stealing. Kamon's trademark was this fast and furious, though not terribly exact, twin-axe attack. A short, stocky man, he was a fighter many less experienced opponents underestimated. Anyone who had been fighting as long as Abdel had, though, could tell by the man's quick, crystal blue eyes that he was a smart and capable fighter. "Abdel," Kamon said, "sorry about your father." It was an old trick, older even than Gorion, who sometimes seemed to Abdel to be the oldest man ever to walk the streets and trails of Faerun. Abdel could see his foster father out of the corner of his eye. Gorion was on his feet, fighting, but as usual trying not to kill the bandit, who was obviously not as considerate as the old man. The dark-complexioned bandit with the elaborately covered headscarf was coming at Gorion with a scimitar too fast, too out of control. Gorion was able to keep him at bay with his heavy oaken staff, but For how long? Abdel let Kamon come in with his right-hand axe and caught it with his blade just under the head. The broadsword's sharp edge cut into the axe handle, and Abdel pulled up but not out, and the axe came out of Kamon's hand so quickly it left a red burn on the bandit's palm. Kamon cursed and backed up 3 quick steps. The loss of one of his weapons surprised him, caught him off guard maybe, but Kamon was experienced enough to keep his eyes open. The axe was still struck on Abdel's blade. Abdel knew he shouldn't stop to try and pull the axe off, but when he heard the crunch of gravel beneath him, he did it anyway. I'm sorry, that was behind him. He was hoping Kamon would do the obvious thing, and Kamon obliged. The bandit came in fast with the other axe, swinging low to cut his victim at the waist. Abdel pulled his knees to his gut, keeping his sword across his chest to protect him. His feet came off the ground and he fell onto his backside. At the same time, the big halberd blade came down from behind him. The crunch of gravel was the heavy steps of Iagus, the first of the bandits Abdel had recognized when they first presented themselves on the road. Iagus still bore the scar on his face from that bet he'd lost to Abdel in Julkun 8 months ago. The memory made Abdel smile, even as he was suddenly drenched in thick, hot blood. Iagus's blow, meant for Abdel, had split Kamon's head in half from crown to chin. Abdel was disappointed only because now he wouldn't be able to ask Kamon if he had ever found out what it was he had been guarding in that warehouse. Still, curled in a ball, Abdel swung his feet up and brought his sword back, the hand axe still stuck awkwardly to the blade. He was hoping to gut Iagus from behind while the halberdier still had his weapon struck in his friend's head. Halfway up, a burning pain drove the breath from Abdel's lungs, and he had instinctively dropped to his feet. The 5th bandit, the one who had been hanging back, had fired a single crossbow bolt into Abdel's right flank. Abdel tore it out, pulling some links loose from his chainmail tunic and roaring at the pain. He made eye contact with the crossbowman just long enough to send the man scurrying backward in fear. The sellsword could only hope the crossbowman was scared enough not to shoot him again. Abdel had more immediate problems. Iagus swore as he worked at wriggling the blade of his halberd out of Kamon's head. He had to stay close to the halberdier, but Abdel gave himself a handful of seconds to check his father's progress. Gorion was holding up well. He was letting his opponent tire himself out with one hopeless lunge of a scimitar after another. "We can go on like this forever, Kalimshite," Gorion said, guessing the man's origin by his peculiar dress and choice of blade. "Or long enough for you to tell me who hired you and why." Abdel grabbed Kamon's axe free of his sword, keeping track of Iagus's hurried progress with one eye, while keeping the other on his father. Okay. Sorry. Like cross-eyed? What the fuck? The Kalashite sellsword smiled, revealing a tarnished silver tooth, and said to Gorion, "We were paid extra, sir, not to say. You can give us your ward, though, and maybe live." There was a sound as if someone had tossed a maiden's thigh melon from a guard tower, and Iagus's halberd was free. He swung the polearm up and round, spraying Abdel and the road with more of Kamon's blood. Abdel threw the axe, and Iagus dodged it easily. The throw wasn't meant to kill, but to force Iagus off balance, and Abdel knew there was only one way, and 1 second, in which to test the success of this method. Abdel came in fast, leaping really and his feet leaving the ground for a risky half-second. He speared at Aegis and felt his blade sink home through a gap in the bandit's rusted armor before he tucked his feet back under him. He meant to stand and drag his blade up through Aegis's guts to disembowel him, but Aegis wasn't quite as off balance as he could have been. The bandit slipped gingerly off the tip of Abdel's blade. There was blood, and Aegis was obviously in pain, but he fought on. The halberd came down hard again, and Abdel almost didn't have a chance to get his sword up to block it. His broadsword blade bit deeply into the thick wood of the halberd's pole, and this time it was Abdel who was disarmed. Aegis, his yellow teeth showing through the brown and grey mass of his ill-kept beard, had the advantage of leverage. Though the act of twisting the long, heavy weapon out of Abdel's strong grasp obviously caused Aegis pain, opening his wound yet wider, the sword came free of Abdel's grip. Aegis allowed himself a coughing laugh when the broadsword fell from the halberd. He wouldn't be as encumbered as Abdel had been, and he took full advantage of it. Abdel could still hear the ringing of steel that meant his father was yet engaged with the Kalashite swordsman. He would have to fight Aegis alone and without his sword. Aegis, maybe a bit fatigued now, maybe having lost too much blood, came in too swiftly and too clumsily, and Abdel was almost disappointed when he easily batted the halberd away with his arm. The force of Abdel's blow meeting Aegis's nearly broke the young sellsword's right forearm. It hurt, but Abdel ignored the pain and kicked up with his left foot, slamming the toe of his sturdy boot into Aegis's sleeping wound. Aegis shrieked and dropped, his knees falling out from under him like dry twigs. Abdel pulled out the dagger Gorion had given him as a coming-of-age gift, the one with the silver blade. He cut Aegis's throat, watching the man's eyes as his life fled him. Abdel smiled at the sight, though he knew Gorion wouldn't approve. And that's when he realized Gorion was still fighting, and there was... The crossbowman stepped out, dark eyes slitted against the mid-morning sun, padded leather vest creaking with every movement, his long red hair fluttering greasily in the breeze. He aimed carefully at Gorion. Abdel screamed out, "Fa!" The crossbow released, and the heavy steel bolt shot through the air with a hiss, "Father!" embedding itself deeply into Gorion's eye. "Father!" Abdel knew, before Gorion's twitching body hit the gravel road, that the only father he had ever known was dead. Red filled his vision. A ringing filled his ears. There was a stinging taste of copper in his mouth, and Abdel went mad. He ran at the Kalashite swordsman first, simply because he was the closer of the two surviving bandits. Abdel's heavy silver dagger was out in front of him, just swinging back and forth, as if he was walking a field with it. The Kalashite danced back and brought his scimitar up. There was a clang of metal, and the Kalashite pronounced the first syllable of the name of some forgotten god as Abdel's sturdy blade thrashed through the finely wrought scimitar. 2/3 of the curved blade spun wildly off into the brush and the side of the wide gravel road, and the Kalashite couldn't help but watch it spin away as he continued to back up and out of the reach of the slashing dagger. The Kalashite's foot dropped 1.5 inches into a wagon wheel rut out in the road, and he fell backward off balance, enough to be saved from the next slash that might have taken his throat out. Growling in feral, incoherent rage, Abdel came forward and slashed again. His arm vibrated from the sudden resistance along the blade of the heavy dagger. The Kalimshite probably saw his broken blade bounce once after it hit the ground, before the world spun and something wet and sticky splashed across his face. Yes, we are reading erotic fanfiction. His severed head might have lived long enough to experience that, but he was dead before his head and his body hit the ground. The crossbowman didn't bother to wait long enough to curse or beg or be horrified. He wasn't the smartest man on the Salt Coast, far from it, but he was more than smart enough to know when to turn around and run for his life. Abdel, still wild with a murderous frenzy now, wholly out of his control, chased the man down and butchered him into a mound of bleeding meat. Finally spent, the foster son of Gorion of Candlekeep collapsed onto a pile of leather, gore, and crossbow parts as he wept. Abdel had been selling his strong sword arm and experience up and down the Salt Coast for years, and he had spent the last 10 days escorting a merchant caravan from Baldur's Gate to the library at Candlekeep. The massive monastery had been his boyhood home, the closest thing to a real home Abdel had ever known. It was there that Gorion, a kind but stern monk, had raised Abdel in the worship of Torm, god of the brave and the foolish, and had tried to instill upon Abdel his own love of the written word and the history and traditions of Faerun. Abdel had studied hard, but his mind wandered, and both he and his adopted father soon came to realize that he would never live the life of a monk, cloistered away copying the great texts, storing away the knowledge and experience of others. No, Abdel sought his own knowledge, his own experience, and he found it in the world outside the protective walls of Candlekeep. It seemed to frighten Gorion somehow, Abdel's need to fight, to kill. But he seemed to also have some deeper understanding of it, as if he experienced it of his founding son, though he never could really condone it. Abdel looked nothing like this man, who was not truly his father, and seemed to surprise no one who knew them well that they didn't think much alike either. Where Gorion was thin of frame, bookish and rigid of posture, Abdel was powerfully muscled, with chiseled features and ink-black hair. He kept along to flow with the same fluid grace as his body. Abdel was nearly a foot taller than his adopted father, almost 7 feet tall, and probably outweighed the monk threefold. 7 feet, everyone. That is a fucking Shaquille O'Neal right there. Excuse me while I take a drink. What a beast. They hadn't spoken much in the last several years, but when Abdel was offered the spot on the caravan from Baldur's Gate, he jumped at this chance not only because his purse was growing light, but from some lean times. Oh my god. Not only because his purse was growing light from some lean times, but because he truly wanted to see his father again. Their meeting had been oddly emotional from the moment Abdel stepped through the gates of Candlekeep. Gorion was happy to see him. Maybe Abdel had spent too much time with sellswords and hired killers, but it seemed to him that Gorion was almost too happy to see him. They had talked of many things that first evening. Gorion was always curious to hear Abdel's stories of battles fought and won, of greedy merchants and marauding orcs, or seaside taverns and the warriors' camaraderie. This night, though, Gorion seemed detached, preoccupied, and nothing was more unlike Abdel's father. The young sellsword got the feeling his father needed to tell him something. Abdel, as he was wont to do, simply asked his father what was on his mind. Gorion had smiled and laughed, and hid his face amid a crown of stars. Gorion asked, quoting some bard Abdel vaguely recognized. "Stay of Avreska?" "Paces," Gorion corrected, "if memory serves." Abdel only nodded, and Gorion asked him a simple question. "Will you come with me somewhere?" Abdel sighed deeply. "I can't stay, father, and you know I'll have no more of your books and scrolls." "No, no," Gorion cut his son off with a heavy, worried laugh. "None of that. I meant somewhere outside of the confines of Candlekeep, a place called the Friendly Arms." Abdel had to laugh. Of course he had passed through this legendary roadhouse no more than one occasion. He'd gone there a few times to find work or wine or women, and had never failed to find at least one of the three. What his father might want there, he couldn't hazard a guess. "There are 2 people there. People I must meet," Gorion said, "and the road is treacherous." "Is this something to do with my parents, my mother?" Abdel asked, though he had no idea why, and even tried to stop the words as they passed unbidden through his lips. Gorion's reaction was the same as every time Abdel brought up the subject of the mother and father he never knew. The old monk was pained by the thought. "No," Gorion said simply. Then there was a long, strained, awkward pause before he said, "Not your mother, no. He wanted to go to the Friendly Arms to meet some people who had some information for him. That was all." Gorion's life had been centered around the gathering of other people's information, so Abdel was hardly surprised by the request. He agreed, of course, since he'd probably have to wander into the Friendly Arms on his own anyway. Having his father along for the company on the road would be a pleasant change of pace, so the 2 of them walked out of Candlekeep together for the first time that next morning, and they'd made it well past high sun on the 3rd day out of Candlekeep, following the wide, well-traveled coastway road, before finding their way blocked by a band of cutthroats. And we snap back to the fight. This was a little flashback. It's confusing, I know. Abdel rushed to the side of his fallen father at the first sudden sight of life. It was a ragged, gurgling intake of breath, and Abdel crawled toward it like a drowning man to a floating barrel, his wounded side sending brilliant flashes of pain from his waist up to his neck and into the space behind his eyes. Abdel fell to the ground more than sat. He tried to say, "Father," or something else, but the sound stuck in his throat. He lodged there painfully until he thought the word itself would choke him. His father's one remaining eye wandered, searching blindly, and his left hand fumbled in a pouch at his belt. His right hand was twitching with painful spasms, glowing at the gravel as if trying to push the pain away. "Mine," Gorion managed to say, just that one clear word. "Yes," Abdel breathed, his throat tightening again to cut off any more words, and his eyes once more filling with tears at the sight of his bleeding, dying father. "Stop it," Gorion said, again in an unbelievably clear voice. He said something else then, something Abdel couldn't make out. The old monk's hands came up, and Abdel barely realized he was working a spell. Gorion touched him roughly, the dying man's hand falling more than a reaching up to the young sellsword's side. A wave of warmth washed over Abdel's midsection, and the burning pain abated all at once. Gorion hissed out a long, pained breath, and Abdel, the wound on his side now closed, almost completely healed, said, "And now you." Gorion didn't begin another casting. Last one, the monk croaked out. Abdel wanted to spit his anger at his foster father for wasting his single healing prayer. "You're dying," was all he could say. "Stop the war, I'm not." And Gorion's body shuddered with a racking cough, and his left hand came up with a sudden jerk that made Abdel flinch. Gorion was holding a tattered scrap of parchment in his hand, and it tugged in the goose feather-fletched quarrel still protruding from his ruined eye. The parchment picked up some blood. Sorry guys. What? Abdel reached out to the... I don't know what this term is also. Abdel reached out to catch his father's hand, and Gorion let go of the parchment. "I'm taking you back to Candlekeep," Abdel said, shifting noisily in the gravel as he made to lift Gorion in his arms. "No," the monk grunted, stopping him. "No time. Leave me. Come back for me." Gorion's body was seized by a shuddering wave of pain, and Abdel sighed at the sight of it. "Your father." Then another cough. A single tear dropped from the only eye that Gorion had left to cry with, and he managed to say, "Khalid and Jah," before his last breath hissed away and his eye turned skyward. Abdel cried over his father's until Gorion's right hand stopped twitching. Okay, the sellsword's hand brushed with the parchment, and without thinking he took it in his grip. He sat there for a long time on the road, surrounded by the dead and the call of crows, until he finally could stand and begin to prepare his father's grave. Chapter 2. Tomoko could not see what her lover saw when he stared into the empty frame. There might have been a picture in there once, perhaps a mirror of silvered glass, but now it was just a frame, hanging by small brass chains from the ceiling of Sarevok's private chamber. Sometimes he would stare at the thing for hours at a time, occasionally muttering a curse or jest to himself, or taking scribbled notes down in an expensive notebook, bound in a gem-encrusted leather. Tomoko could not read the language of Faerun, was uncomfortable even with the intricate characters of her native Kozakura, so she had no idea what he was writing. She knew only that Sarevok saw things in that frame, kept track of things, kept watch on his pawns, and he had many pawns. She sat with her legs folded on the wide, too-soft bed, a silk sack 8 feet on its side stuffed with feathers, and tried to mediate. Something was prickling the back of her neck, though, and it was distracting her. The smooth silk of Tomoko's black pajamas hissed against the silk of the bed and sent a chill of goosebumps up her thin, strong arms. She was a small woman, not even 5 feet tall, with the smooth skin of a pampered lady and the strength of a berserker. A life of constant training made her what she was, a killer. In every sense of the word. If you know what I mean. She didn't bother to close her eyes, but kept her tongue on her palate and concentrated on her breathing, and on the blood flowing quickly through her veins. The room was dark, and the air still. 2 things that normally helped her to center herself, but not today. The Today, the air in Sarevok's private chamber, deep in a complex of rooms few ever saw the inside of, felt heavy and dead. The steady orange candlelight, barely flickering in the still air, made her blink. The dampness made her silk garments stick to her every modest curve. Minutes dragged on, and she continued to struggle to mediate. When Sarevok stared this intently and seemed this disappointed, it usually meant he was going to ask her to kill someone, so she would need her concentration. "My brother," Sarevok said suddenly, so suddenly a lesser trained assassin might have flinched, but not Tomoko, "is on the path." "Your brother?" she asked, too quickly, and Sarevok took a long, unsettling time to turn around. "I have at least this one brother, yes," Sarevok told her in that voice she often thought was not seductive, maybe seductive. A cold chill ran down her spine, making her angry with herself. There was something about Sarevok to be sure that she knew she should be on her guard about. He wasn't a man, not a human, that was certain. Even the barbarian men of Faerun were more like her own kind than Sarevok was. She had no idea what he was, but she liked it. He wore power around him in a haze like Faerunian women wore perfume. She could imitate him, steeped in it. He was decisive and sure, not blundering about it at the whim of a god, nor blindly attached to some infantile cause, nor forever in search of shiny metal discs. Sarevok wanted power and something else. As afraid as Tomoko sometimes felt in his presence, she couldn't help but admire him. The fact remained that when they were together, in the dark, with nothing physical coming between them, even then he could tell her only what he wanted her to know, and he never wanted her to know much. He was in control, always. "The nature of his death?" she asked, meaning two things: that she knew she was here to kill for him, and that she was loyal enough not to ask why. Sarevok laughed at the sound, and the sound made Tomoko smile. Not because his laugh was particularly pleasant, but because it wasn't all that pleasant. "Indeed, this was no mere man. Then he will live," she concluded. And Sarevok continued to smile his dire wolf's smile, and leaned forward, and rose and slithered into the bed, coming slowly toward her. For the briefest fraction of a heartbeat, she wanted to back away to escape the hard, tight, masterful embrace she knew was coming. But that was her mind's reaction. Her body's was something else entirely. They slid together easily, and the touch was warm, welcoming, and full of a promise of danger that drew her to him in the first place, kept her coming back, and finally made her his slave. She'd kill for him 10, 12, 15 times. She had allowed herself to lose count, and would easily kill 100 more if he would look at her like that, hold her like that, move into, through her, then past her like that, just one more time. "This one," he breathed into her ear. The sound seemed made more of heat than air. "Will live for a long time." He pulled away suddenly, and she heard herself gasp. She was disciplined enough to keep herself from blushing, but a twinkle in Sarevok's eye told her he noticed. Sarevok always noticed. "Methuselah," he told her, "will live for a time as well, but only for a time. I will bring them here from Nashkel." They have been useful to you, Tomoka said, her voice sounding small next to his. So they shall die quickly. Sarevok laughed again, and Tomoka had to work hard to suppress a shudder. It wasn't excitement she felt this time. Let us not jump to any hasty conclusions, darling girl, he said. They have the ability to fail me, especially the little one. Chapter 3. During the days of the Avatars, the Black Lord will spawn a score of mortal progeny. These offspring will be aligned good and evil, but chaos will flow through them all. When the murderous bastard children come of age, they will bring havoc to the lands of the Sword Coast. One of these children must rise above the rest and claim their father's legacy. This inheritor will shape the history of the Sword Coast for centuries to come. Nonsense. Abdel couldn't believe it, but there it was. The sheet of stiff parchment his father had thought so important that he clutched it with his last quiver of energy in a dying hand. That he smeared it with his own blood was a disconnected bit of rambling about what? Some dead god maybe, if the reference to avatars was indeed about the time of troubles, when gods walked over like men and like men died there. Nonsense. When he had first started to read it over the still form of his father, Abdel had been certain it was some personal message, some secret his father had been keeping from him. When he first unfolded it and turned his still weeping gaze up to the graying sky, he thought it must have been about his mother. Maybe a message from her, a letter she had written to her infant son moments before she died, or gave him up, or sent him away, or sold him, or anything. Anything that would provide some explanation for why he never knew her. Instead, it was just nothing. A scrap of words that formed a bit of some prophecy that may or may not come true, but wouldn't, Abdel was sure, have anything to do with him. Whatever is to come to pass, old man, Abdel said to his father just before he laid him into his shallow grave. You won't be around to see it. Maybe I won't be either. He wanted to say something else. He searched his mind and his heart for some prayer, some line of verse or story, for some memory. He struggled to find words, some marker to the winds that this man had passed from its breath, but there was nothing. The rain started as he filled the dirt and gravel over the dead body of his father, and Abdel let the rain wash away his tears. When he was done, he stood to his full height and turned his face up toward the cold droplets. He ran one hand through his thick black hair and closed his eyes, letting the rain wash away Gorion's grave dirt and blood. His father had tended into the wound in his side. It had been deep, but it was now almost all healed. He refused to feel the lingering pain, but it was difficult. He wouldn't live with a wounded heart. His father was dead at the hands of bandit sellswords. Someone paid to kill him, and probably paid well. It was business, that was all, but by failing to kill Abdel too, it was business left undone. Left for Abdel to finish himself. Abdel, son of Gorion, adjusted his chain-mail tunic, scuffed his hard leather boots on the gravel to clear away some of the mud, shifted his shoulders to center the weight of the big broadsword that hung from his back, found a stick and set it upright in disturbed earth. He hung on a wet wood the tiny silver gauntlet that his father had worn on a thin gold chain around his neck, knowing some anonymous traveler would be along soon enough to steal it. "I'll be back for you," he said, then turned his back and walked away. It was impossible to tell what made the horrific sound that snatched Abdel out of a restless sleep, or how far away the source of it was, but he was on his feet in an instant. He had buried his adopted father that day and made it to where the Way of the Lion from Candlekeep met the long, well-traveled coastway road. A stone marker had been erected there, intricately carved from a solid block of granite, and it had been a welcome sight when he had seen it days ago on his way to Candlekeep. Now it was a reminder of all he had lost since then. With Gorion gone, Abdel wasn't even sure he'd be allowed back into Candlekeep. Now there was little time for those thoughts. The sound was getting closer, and getting closer fast. It was like a chorus of angry dogs competing for attention with 1,000 bards, whose tongues had been cut out so... Wait, give me a second, chat. What the fuck is this sentence? It was like a chorus of angry dogs competing for attention with 1,000 bards whose tongues had been cut out so all they could do was wail and mutter, grunt and shout. The sound made Abdel afraid, and that was a rare thing. He had to force himself back against the stone marker, so strong was his urge to slash out into the night at that fear. Abdel assumed he was in for a fight with whatever was making that god's-forsaken racket. Whatever it was, it sounded like a lot of somethings, and he would have to fight as much with his mind as with his arm to make up for the odds. The stone felt rough and wet against his back, and he realized he'd removed his chainmail tunic when he lay down to sleep. The night was dark, still overcast from the afternoon and evening's rain. Abdel set his eyes to slits to try to cut through the darkness and see what was making this noise, which was now so loud that Selsolt's ears began to sting. The chorus of incoherent vocalizations threatened to drive Abdel mad with fear and rage. He saw the whole thing first as a mass of shadow, like it was one thing, huge, moving along the ground to the south of the crossroads. The mass hit a tree, not a huge tree but sizable, and seemed to suck it under without hesitating. Then the mass started to take on shapes inside it, and Abdel realized to his horror and frustration that this loud gibbering mass was a horde of individual creatures, hundreds of them, that walked like men. Apologies, this was a loud gibbering mass, it was not a gibberling mass. Okay, sorry. Abdel drew in a breath slowly, his jaw slack so he wouldn't hiss and give himself away, though the moon was tucked behind a mantle of cloud and not a single star was visible. Abdel was thankful suddenly that he wasn't wearing his armor. A reflection might have attracted the attention of any one member of this impossible swarm and sent the entire horde in his direction. Even Abdel couldn't possibly defend himself against this tide of dark-skinned bodies. Just then, Abdel saw the glint of steel among the shadows of the horde. They've got swords, he thought. They're armed with swords. This made him realize he was holding a lot of telltale steel himself, and he silently slipped the broadsword blade behind his back. He didn't gasp when he heard the rustle of gravel behind him. On the other side of the crossroads marker, he tightened his grip on his sword and tried to think of a prayer to Torm. The sound behind him stopped, but he didn't dare turn around. His attention behind him. Abdel didn't hear a thing approaching from his left side, but he could smell it before he even realized what he was doing. He brought his blade back around in front of him, twisted his wrist and slashed low across his left side. The blade met with resistance, and though Abdel couldn't see the beast in the darkness, he knew by the fact that it didn't scream that he had killed it instantly. There was a flurry of babbling, yelling, guttural throat noises that burst into Abdel's hearing right after that though, and he realized there were more, lots more, and they had seen him. As much trouble as Abdel was having seeing anything but the vague outline of his enemy, the whole things seemed to have no trouble seeing him. Rusted, pitted, jagged blades slashed at Abdel, and the noise was deafening. He flicked back one attack after another, killed one of the things and another, all the time keeping his back against the stone marker. He kept his blade slashing in front of him to make a sort of wall of steel, but the occasional slice got through. The wound in his side began to hurt again, but he had to ignore it and keep fighting. When he killed another one of the screaming, babbling things, another stepped on the back of its fallen holdmate and came at Abdel anew. Abdel began to realize he was going to die that night. There was a subtle change in the tenor of the mass sound, and after a few seconds of an altogether different keening wail, the horde turned as one and came north to Abdel. Abdel kept batting them away, one after another, until he was covered in blood. Some of it his. It seemed like hours, like forever, but only seconds passed before a sudden burst of light blinded the sword. There was no noise, no thunder, but Abdel was sure it must have been lightning striking the stone over his head. He'd had his eyes wide open, drinking in any meager scram of light he could, when the yellow flash came out of nowhere. He screamed in pain and clenched his eyes tight. Tears streamed down his gore-splattered face, and the rhythm of his defensive slashes faltered. The sound of the horde of creatures made in reaction to the light was deafening. 1,000 varieties of keening wail sent shivers through Abdel's body. It sounded like a whole village being slaughtered at the same time. They stopped attacking, and as Abdel bunked past huge amorphous blobs of purple and electric blue that filled his vision, he saw the horde retreat. The creatures ugly, naked humanoids with sickly purple hides stretched over taut muscles and heads like distorted lions with wiry black manes, fled the light that still burned brightly, but with no heat above Abdel's head. Exhausted and relieved, Abdel slid down to his knees, the stone scraping through his thin chemise. He was panting, almost grasping for air, and his sword seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Good enough," a reedy, gruff voice said. "Ye can stop that damn light." Abdel wanted to spring to his feet and whirl into a defensive stance against the stranger, but he just couldn't. He decided to wait until whoever spoke those words came close enough that he could kill him without standing up. "It will go away on its own, right?" another voice asked. "Let's get a look at our new friend." Footsteps came round the stone marker, 2 sets, and Abdel did manage to stand to meet them, though his chest still heaved. He closed his eyes tight again, holding his sword out in front of him with both hands. He was looking down when he opened his eyes. He saw, past smaller purple flashes this time, a pair of bare white feet, covered in the instep with thick curly red hair. The boots that stood next to those feet were finely made of shiny black leather. One of the newcomers chuckled and said, "How you faring, boy?" Abdel had to laugh. He wasn't faring very well at all. "It's the second time this day," Abdel said, blinking his watery eyes to finally clear his vision, "that I've had to fight for my life. Do you intend to make it a third?" "Ha! The one with the hairy feet." Abdel could see now he was a halfling, exclaimed. "We intend no such thing, lad." "By all means, no," the other one, a tall, thin human draped in black robes, added. "Rest easy, rest easy." Abdel studied those two unlikely rescuers. The halfling was odd for his kind, though he was as short, stocky, and fair of complexion as most of his race. He had a devilish quality to him, though, that Abdel had seen in a long parade of sellswords, thugs, thieves, and rogues, but not many halflings. He was wearing thick reddish-brown leather, worked into armor to protect his vitals, but could leave his arms free. A long sword of excellent make, an imposing weapon for one as small as he, hung at his side in a gold filigreed scabbard. The halfling wriggled his pug nose and smiled back at Abdel's stare. "G'day, young sir," he said in an odd accent that might have been Waterdeep, some city, Abdel was certain, which was again unusual for a halfling. "Name's Montaron, and me travelling companion here is Zar. As set the god's awful bright light as him that set the god awful bright light up there to interrupt that little party we're throwing." Abdel nodded to the halfling and turned his attention to the human. The one called Zar was tall, thin, and twitchy. His face kept moving like there was worms under his skin, and his mouth worked as if he were talking to himself silently at all time. Every once in a while he'd twitch his head violently to one side, as if to shoo away a fly that wasn't really there. "Gibberlings," the human said, "are not quite at all." A twitch made him pause. "Fond of light at all?" "Gibberlings," Abdel repeated, understanding that was the name of the horde of beasts, an apt name for all their incomprehensible vocalizing. "And yeah," the halfling prompted. "Abdel," he said, shifting his sword to his left hand and holding out his right. "I am Abdel, son of Gorion." Montaron took Abdel's hand, and his grip was firm. He smirked a little, as if at some private joke. Zar rubbed nervously at his own face, absent-mindedly tracing lines around the rather prominent tattooed mask surrounding his eyes. When the halfling's hand fell away, Abdel turned his open palm to Zar, but the human twitched away from it and made a quarter turn as if to wander off. "You'll have to excuse me, friend here," the halfling said, nodding to Zar. "Not the friendliest sort, but them casties he does makes him mighty in a pinch." Abdel thought nothing of it. This Zar was a strange one, but he had met stranger. "I should thank you," Abdel said to the halfling. "Ye should," Montaron chuckled. "If ye had any manners, I don't myself intend not to expect them in others. It's rather an easy work. Maybe we can offer ye a chance to return the favor, eh?" "I'm bound for the friendly arms," Abdel said, raising his eyebrows to wait for a response. Zar grunted, but Montaron only continued to smile blankly. "You'll find more work in Nashkel," the halfling said. "Nashkel? Aye." Montaron stared when suddenly it was dark again. The magical light went out all at once and seemed to take the sound of a receding horde of humanoids with it. "Thank the Lord of 3 Crowns," Montaron said, his voice suddenly edged with a surprising glee. "Was beginning to think that would never fade away. Things are clearer in the dark, ain't they, Abdel?" The sellsword only blinked, hoping not to go blind from all the sudden changes in lightning. "Anyway," Montaron added, "there's work for ye that have you taken in Nashkel." I have business at the Friendly Arms. So you're not in need of work? And Abdel was in fact quite in need of work, but promises had been made, and there was his Khalid and another waiting for Gorion at the Friendly Arms. The Gnome Run Roadhouse was 3 days' travel to the north, and Nashkel was a full 10-day in the opposite direction. What kind of work? The kind of work I'm guessing you're in, the halfling said, and lots of it. Work around the campfires as there's some trouble in the mines there. I have to go to the Friendly Arms first, Abdel said flatly. There are people waiting for me there, but I will be in need of work. So the roadhouse first, then? Zar asked, matter-of-factly, and in the darkness Abdel couldn't tell if the mage was talking to him or to the halfling. Montour solved the problem by answering, Aye, the Friendly Arms first, then, Nashkel. I could use a night's sleep in the real bed anyway. And that is chapter 3 from the first book of the Baldur's Gate novel. Thank you guys very much for listening, and I wish you all a nice day. Goodbye.